Christina Herberson, Head of APAC and Africa Managing Director at Nuveen Natural Capital. Liam Lenihan, Managing Director of GoFarm. And they're talking to the wonderful co-host of the Australian Ag Podcast, Weekly Times editor, James Baxter. Please welcome our panel.
Yeah, for you. David Williams, ladies and gentlemen. This time 12 months ago, you were sitting here in a raccoon hat, talking all upbeat about global trade. So my question is, what the hell is that? And is this some kind of William Wallace uprising, or?
No, well, I was, it's not the Williams tartan, by the way, but I was going to tell a story about some Scottish fund managers who bought a property recently that we're involved in, paid what I thought was 50% over the market, and the very next week the government did a compulsory acquisition on them. So that's all I had to say, really. I mean, it's a cheap trick.
It is. Oh, you got the other one too.
I do happen to have the other one, which is, I said last year it was my Ukrainian sympathy hat, but I actually bought it in Saskatchewan. And so I knew we were going to talk about investment, and one of the most active investors in the country, of course, is PSP. Yeah. And I thought the big boss, Mark, was going to be here, but so I bought this for him, really.
Perfect.
So anyway, that's enough of my tips.
Excellent. Okay, thanks for those. Ladies and gentlemen, so we've obviously had 3 years of pretty incredible growth in the rural property sector. There's been fantastic seasonal conditions, low interest rates, and record farm gate returns. The tide's starting to turn on all three. We're staring down the barrel of a drier than average El Nino. Our friends at the RBA keep cranking up things on the interest rate fronts, and commodity prices, particularly for livestock we're seeing at the moment, are certainly coming off. So this is going to be a discussion about where to from here. So I think let's address the most obvious question. How is investment in farmland tracking, and what impact are the high interest rates having on agricultural assets? We might start with you, Liam.
Thanks, James. Well, how's investment tracking? Investment returns have been brilliant. I think that's well documented. 20% compound annual growth rate of about 8.5%, a 5-year run of 11.5% and 20% last year. So there's been a lot of money made in recent years and beyond that too in owning land and water. It feels like it's priced millimetre perfect now. As you say, we've had 3 years consecutively of record commodity prices and production. And so that's built balance sheets, it's delivered profitability with plentiful capital and cheap capital. That's really fueled the boom. But I think we're now heading into some challenging times with forecasts of drought, rising interest rates, a big step back in commodity values. I think the A-class and the B-class assets, we're going to see them start to stratify.
Still a good time to invest in Aussie Ag. You've got, GoFarm's got $850 million worth of assets. Are you still...
Well, so you say.
So
yeah. Is it a good time? Yeah, it is. I think we're cautious for the reasons cited. So there's some big headwinds or sinks on land value, but there's also the emergence of societal expectation around land management and stewardship, biodiversity, carbon, of course, and we've got some wind farms here behind us. So there's optionality in owning large tracts of land, and we're seeing renewable energy influence come in. We're seeing carbon influence come in. So yeah, there's a bit of push and pull, and it's hard. The rural landscape's not homogenous. There's going to be assets that continue to perform, and I think there's going to be assets that go backwards from here.
Yeah. Christina, Nuveen has $2.2 billion worth of assets here in Australia. How are you seeing the situation at the moment?
Yeah, maybe from a truly global perspective, we have $2.2 billion here in Australia, but from our global portfolio of more than 600 properties across 10 countries, that's only 15% of value and about a third of total hectares. So what we saw in Australia, totally agree, more than 20% growth, very, very strong. We're proud of the performance here. We did see that in other parts of the world, in the US and Brazil. And, those situations of the high commodity prices, very low interest rates, fueled similar growth. So higher interest rates, what we've seen in our research over many years and more than 36 years of experience in farmland investing is that if you use inflation kind of as a proxy for higher interest rates, Farmland typically does perform very well. We've seen in our U.S. research, more than 8% spread over 10 years over inflation on farmland returns. But as you've said, interest rates really aren't the only factor here. There's many more, and for that reason, we do think that acceleration over the last 3 years will start to slow. We've seen that before in Australia and other parts of the world. Yeah. We'll talk more about the other factors.
Yeah. David, what are you saying?
Well, I think it's a sort of tale of two cities, because there's still quite heavy demand coming out of North America and Canada, the Ivy League universities in particular, and the PSPs and Ontarios and so forth. So that doesn't seem to have diminished much. But on the PE side of it, we're seeing a big slowdown there. So there's still a lot of young guys in the PE funds who want to invest because they've got, dry capital, but by the time it gets up to the investment committee, there's a lot of, wrenching and gnashing of teeth about, geez, have we seen the worst? Why don't we wait for 6 months? I think one of the bright spots we're seeing is that the Chinese are back, and surprisingly back in a way which is the worst of what they had last time. In other words, people that aren't necessarily related to assets, they're not farmers, but they want to own assets to either get money out of China or for some other reason. But we just saw a property sold the other day for 120 to a Chinese textile manufacturer. So you shouldn't need to buy the cotton to do it, but they did, And so that part of it looks like it's strong. And I think the Chinese, because they're back and because the FIRB's got the door slightly ajar, we're going to see a fair bit more of that in the next 6 months, I think. Yeah. And there's a bit of it going on now. And I think the third part of it is just what's happening with the farmers themselves. So there's a lot of farmers who, for the last 2 years have been borrowing money at 2% and buying the farm next door. That's all stopped because they just can't get the money now out of Rabo or whoever it is. But having said that, there's a lot of farmers that are still buying properties that have made a lot of money, in the last couple of years, either out of cattle or cotton or something like that. So you look at Pete Harris, he's probably one of the biggest cotton growers in the country, just bought a property for $300 million up in the northern country up in Queensland. So, on the back of what he's made out of cotton, presumably. So, so that's, there's a tale of two cities in each of those camps, if you like.
So the demand across the board, Liam, obviously you guys are investing heavily in the horticulture and cropping spaces. Is that where you see the best bang for your buck?
I think it's a case-by-case basis, and I'm not well placed to comment on the beef industry and what's happening there. I often quote Bill Malcolm, who's the ag economics professor at Melbourne Uni. He says it's a free country. You can choose to farm as badly as you like. And I think the flip side of that is the good companies, the good producers will continue to make good decisions, execute well and generate really compelling returns. And the others will do as they please. So I don't think it's commodity or I don't think it's defined by commodity or geography. It really comes down to decision making and execution. And as I say, those that are at the top of their game will continue to be and find opportunities.
Yep. And you agree with that, Christina, from your perspective?
I think that's the beauty of Australian agriculture, the diversity across different farming systems, climatic conditions. Look, from a global perspective, our strategy also aligns with global diversification. So what I'm interested might overlap with Liam, maybe not. But I think you can think of all kinds of investment strategies that suit different types of land, whether that's pasture grazing for soil carbon sequestration. We've seen successful dry land cropping portfolios. So I think what you will be more cautious about is obviously water security. And as we look at the climate volatility and changing climate conditions, those areas that might be more prone to the extremes of drought and floods.
David, you touched earlier that the FIRB has got the door slightly ajar. Obviously, the Foreign Investment Review Board monitor overseas investments in Australian ag. It came under fire during COVID because of the lengthy process that was involved and also the, quote, not by me, but the exorbitant fees being charged. How easy or hard is it to invest in Australia in a post-COVID world?
Oh, look, it's very easy if you're other than Chinese. But even Chinese, I think I said it's partly a job, but the FIRB seems to be quite helpful now. Helpful is probably too strong a word, but they've certainly got the door open. But don't try and buy a port. or a power station or an infrastructure asset. But if you're buying most of the stuff we're talking about here in terms of horticulture or land or something, should be no problems now.
Yeah. And Christina, how are you seeing it as Australia, as a US-based company? How are you seeing investment in Australia? Quite easily?
Yeah, well, I mean,
Not easy, but yeah.
just returned from a trip to Africa, so I guess you kind of step back. We're looking at the broad scope of investable opportunities in farmland. We can't take for granted, having the basics here, a strong political climate, regulatory climate. When you look at FIRB, I think, the key is really consistency, transparency, and fairness. And as you said, I think that's been improving.
Yeah. Liam, you've got obviously one of the Go Farms partners up at the Canali Almond Orchard at Swan Hill is a US-based institution. Foreign investment is important to Australian ag?
Yes, yeah, that's true. We do have a US partner there. Primarily, it's Australian capital that we're investing. There's two things, I suppose. One, as an Australian-owned business, investing Australian capital, we like the FIRB process. It gives us a competitive advantage. On the flip side, it's well documented the capital gap that exists from the level of investment in Australian agriculture today to what it needs to be for the industry to be able to realise its full potential. And you can quote various reports. I think ANZ Greener Pastures is quoting 230 to 400 billion in the next 7 years to get to optimal level of investment. There doesn't seem to be the capacity or the will domestically to make that commitment. So I think it's prudent that we do open up, and we are, to foreign investment. It's an important part of the Australian landscape.
Looking forward, all indications are we're heading into a period of El Nino. There's all sorts of big scary words being thrown around that don't yet start with a D, but they soon could. How do you see investments playing out in the short to medium term? David, we'll start with you down the end.
Well, I think there's a lot of water around at the moment, so that's a good thing, and there's enough water in the soil that I think you should be pretty relaxed, depending on which water system you're on, but on most of them for the next 2 years. But there's no doubt that there's a lot of people that are exposed, and a lot of people, for example, in horticulture, that's taken advantage of really high water prices, decided to trade it in the way in which Boundary Bend did, a couple of years back. And if it does go to the word D, then there's going to be a lot of people in trouble. But I think it's made worse by the fact that I don't think people widely understand how hard it is in horticulture at the moment, and in lots of other farming as well. But labour's still a massive problem, and weather has been a massive problem, so, you can look at a lettuce worth $15 and, marvel at the fact that McDonald's now has to put cabbage in a bun. But it's $15 because there's no lettuces, because the
100%.
fields have been flooded out and so forth. So labour's a problem, weather's been a big problem, the dollar's been a problem, and depending on where you are, let's say dairy, for example, the milk prices are a problem, even though it's been unbelievably high, which, is a bad thing for the processors, but you're still seeing farmers leave the land, so it's you get a shortage, and next thing you're fighting each other for the milk, and so everywhere in farming, I think it's less so in where you've got low labour and so forth, but everywhere in farming is pretty tough work.
We'll jump to you, Christina. What are your thoughts about the challenges and opportunities heading forward?
Look, we always think about our farmland investments very long term. We've been through periods of droughts and floods and these cycles before. Obviously in Australia, a little bit more extreme. But long term, the fundamentals are extremely strong. To feed a population of more than 9 billion, we need 60% more calories, 100% more protein, and 200% more timber that competes against that land. We also see globally, we need to improve our carbon efficiency and food productivity by a factor of 5. So those fundamentals are strong. We think we'll make it through short and medium term. I do agree with the short-term sentiments.
On that point, Christina, sustainability, natural capital, it's possibly the two biggest phrases in ag in the past couple of years. What's your take on natural capital, and how do you see it playing out in Aussie ag?
Well, I guess where sustainability and farmland intersect, that's really natural capital. For us, it was a couple years ago, we brought together our Westchester farmland business and Greenwood timberland business under one umbrella, Natural Capital. And that's because we see farm management, land management is very holistic, covering nature, climate, and people. So focusing on regenerative land management, the biodiversity components, carbon sequestration, carbon mitigation, and ultimately food sustenance and thriving communities. We see on the demand side, many of our investors, particularly in Japan and Europe, very focused on the carbon intensity of their investments. Lots of questions around biodiversity, nature, positive climates. We have not only countries, but corporations making net zero carbon commitments and millions of acres going into sustainable agriculture programs. Companies like Nestle investing more than $1 billion in regenerative agriculture. Here in Australia on the supply side, I think we have great opportunities in our farming landscapes to not only have a really productive core farming system, but also add biodiversity and carbon sequestration. Encouraged by the government and the nature repair market and a maturing carbon market here. So we're positive on natural capital, in particular in Australia.
And just quickly, Liam, where does GoFarm sit in the natural capital and sustainability?
I guess from our perspective, we think it's business as usual. I mean, good operators do all those things already. Perhaps it's the measuring and reporting of it that needs to be improved to communicate to customers and to community that this is how we go about it. But it's not something new for ourselves or for businesses that conduct themselves in a sustainable manner.
I think the other thing, James, that is emerging is when you look at some of the funds that are coming in, they want, of course, carbon, they want sustainability, etc. But a lot of people are looking for indigenous. And that's pretty hard to deliver in this country, notwithstanding everybody wants to develop the north. But, that's where Twiggy's headed, of course, is to, how we can do things for the indigenous communities. But the funds are now looking for that as well. And outside of, say, Ord 2 or Ord 3, there's not that much up there, of substance,
Interesting.
Great. We're going to get some questions from the floor. I've got one down here at the front. If we can get a microphone down here. Anyone with a microphone? Is there one on that chair still next to you, Liam?
No.
Here we go. High speed. Here we go. Round the track, round the corner. Great. Just here. Thank you.
Where's your father, by the way? I thought he was the only one who's allowed to ask questions.
He'll be there. Don't worry. You'll find him.
Thanks, Jackson. Bill Herditch here. Question about the natural capital. Is it an either-or, food production or natural capital? How do you integrate this properly? Because there's been a lot of complaints about, farmers saying, well, we can either sequester carbon or we can grow livestock. We can't do both. So the panel comment on the sort of integration of the natural capital with the food production?
Might start.
Jenny, yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with you. Natural capital is what farmers are already doing today. I think it's the harmony, and I don't think at all it's either or. Regenerative ag practices, if you don't like the word, improving farming practices in the system that you operate, they naturally do improve soil health, water retention, carbon sequestration. But maybe looking a little bit more in the degraded areas. Most farms that I've seen, growing up, there's always some non-productive areas, and thinking more about how we utilize those for biodiversity and carbon.
Great, thank you. We've got a question over here.
Thank you. Caitlin McConnell from Clayton Utes and Chair of the Future Farmers Network. We've had a few discussions today in respect of the potential of utilisation of a food plan, which potentially could look at, the fundamental right to food and water. We've got the ongoing food security inquiry here in Australia. Do you think that off back of potentially the roadmap that CSIRO will be putting out in a few weeks, that potentially a national food security strategy that recognises fundamental right to food and sustainable agricultural practices, but then also climate mitigation and net zero discussions, could actually help inform some investment decisions and discussions here in Australia, really making sure that we're doubling down on the fundamentals of agriculture and the key role it plays in respect of those markets, particularly natural capital.
And do you want to pick someone to answer that question?
Well, I'm interested to, I think from a natural capital and agriculture perspective, but Christina, first and foremost, from an international perspective, you've recognised that we need to feed individuals, that's a fundamental, but also look after our agriculture sector. Do you think if there's a clear recognition of that here in Australia through regulation, it may help inform and promote investment further, I guess, from international organisations?
Look, from a international attracting international capital or even Australian super fund capital, I think what helps a lot is ecosystem services opportunities. So the biodiversity markets, the carbon markets, and not only about Australia, but as we've been talking about export opportunities and leveraging that across not only the farmers but the whole value chain to the end product.
Any quick views on that one, Liam?
Yeah, I've got a quick view. Look, I think just going back to Bill's question, which is partly to answer this as well, is that, I don't see any trade-off between sustainability and carbon and so forth. On the contrary, more than any other time in my sort of short history on this world, farmers are really going after carbon and sustainability in a way that actually makes 2 and 2 make 5. And if anything, there's a lot more stuff happening where people are doing things that would never have been done if not for carbon. So I think that's going to be really fantastic for the industry and for the amount of production. I think it doesn't make any sense to me to regulate who gets what in food. I don't think it's going to be possible. And I don't think it should be done. Sounds very socialist to me, but even though I'm wearing a red jacket, I should really be supporting that. But
and a Russian
I just
hat.
don't get that. But I think this, the carbon thing is really important. But I've never seen farmers so proactive, who through their history, just do what I do because my father and his grandfather did it and so forth. But now, everywhere I go, and that's not only just farmers, but it's corporations. So, if I look at some of my clients, like let's say Select Harvest, for example, they're focused like a laser on how we get carbon credits, how we farm more efficiently, but more particularly what we're doing with our waste, which is now a really big thing for all farmers, even including horticulturists. Doing stuff that used to just plough back into the ground is now turned into quite valuable foodstuffs, sometimes more valuable than the core product.
Yeah, and Rob Spurway, who's up a bit later on from GrainCorp, will probably talk about that a bit too. That's all we have time for. Please thank our panellists, David William Wallace, Christina Hermanson, Liam Lenehan, and of course your moderator, James Wagstaff. You'll be back a bit later on, I think, aren't you? Anyway, I'm going to kick you guys off. Thanks so much.